So this lesson's on wheel suspension, the radius and control arms. A wheel suspension with radius and control arms often compromises one or more arms per wheel. There are three basic systems: the longitudinal, transverse, and the wishbone. So here's asking us to select these pieces. So we got the rigid axle, the longitudinal radius arm, the coil spring, and the shock absorber. If you click on these, you can get them to move back and forth. So this shows transverse movement. But use the switch, try moving the axle, which we just did, by dragging it back and forth. What forces do the longitudinal radius arms accommodate best? Longitudinal, not the lateral or side to side. Longitudinal is back to front. When are these longitudinal forces created? During acceleration and deceleration. Click on the components of the system with transversely located radius arms. Here we are. Spring, shock, and wheel. Use the switch and try moving the wheels again. So if you want to come up here and click on this, you can move the wheels back and forth. You can see there's play or movement back and forth, front to back. So these arms are better suited for lateral forces. That's left to right. The transverse forces, when going around corners, you get those forces. Click on the components, the spring, shock absorber, wishbone control arm, and wheel. You won't be able to move these when you click because they're stabilized with the wishbone. The wishbone controls both lateral and longitudinal forces. Here's our wishbone suspension, our longitudinal radius arms, and our transverse radius arms. All right, the second lesson's on the McPherson strut. Click on the strut. Click on the control arm, then click on the strut. What forces do the wishbone control arms absorb, both lateral and longitudinal? Click on the components of the McPherson strut. Well, here we have the spring and the shock. Where is the McPherson strut construction used most? The design is often used in the front wheel suspension, so the front axle. The rigid axle in the rear. Let's click on the rigid axle, the leaf spring, and then the shock absorber. What forces do leaf springs absorb? They absorb both lateral and longitudinal forces. Okay, so here's a different rear axle. We're going to go with the rigid axle. The track bar, which controls the side-to-side or transverse movement. The longitudinal radius arm, which controls the longitudinal movement front to back from accelerating and decelerating. Coil spring and shock absorber. What forces do coil springs absorb? They're not able to absorb either one. Click on the component that absorbs the longitudinal forces. Click on the component that absorbs the transverse forces. Click on the axle with leaf springs and the axle with coil springs. Where is the rigid axle used mostly? In the rear. Okay, so here we're looking for the components for the system with torsion springs. The torsion springs with torsion bars is in the transverse direction of the vehicle or used as the rear axle. You have radius arms, a tube axle, and torsion bars. So you have torsion springs, shock absorber, control arm, and tube axle. What forces do the radius arms absorb? Well, you can read right here. The radius arms accommodate both forces. What forces do the tube axle absorb? Well, again, the tube axle is right here, absorbs both forces as well. Side to side and front to back. Okay, so you've now finished the lesson, so go take the quiz. Hope you do well.